Have you ever stopped to wonder what it felt like to never truly see your own face? Imagine living your entire life knowing your features only as a dark, shifting shape in a pool of water or a ghostly outline in polished stone. Picture a world without mirrors, where your reflection remained a mere rumor or a blurred guess caught in a river's current. For almost all of human history, this was the only reality we knew. But then came a day, a single, transformative moment, when clarity finally arrived and we saw ourselves not as shadows, but as we actually are. This is the story of that metamorphosis, a journey from dark pools to dazzling glass that did far more than change how we looked. It forged the modern self by allowing a human being to meet their own gaze for the very first time. Let's travel back to the very beginning of this story. Imagine kneeling by a still pool in the heart of a prehistoric forest where the water sits like a sheet of liquid slate reflecting the sky. As you lean over the edge, a face suddenly appears. But it isn't the face you recognize from your own mind. It wavers with every tiny ripple, appearing as a distorted phantom made of light and shadow, while your features remain soft and undefined. For thousands of years, this fleeting and imperfect glimpse was the only mirror humanity possessed. This constant distance created a psychological gap between the inner soul and the outer image, meaning you knew you existed, but your appearance remained a vague idea rather than a solid fact. This strange relationship with ourselves only deepened when we began crafting our first physical mirrors. Picture holding a piece of polished obsidian, a heavy shard of black volcanic glass that feels cool against your palm. Your reflection is visible within the stone, yet it looks like a dark silhouette pinned against a night sky. You can see movement and shape, but the fine details of your eyes or skin are lost to the darkness. Later came the era of bronze, where ancient craftsmen spent countless hours burnishing metal until it shone with a dull glow. Even the finest bronze mirror gave back a hazy, golden image that tinged your face with the color of the metal and softened your expression through 1,000 tiny imperfections. You were always looking at a version of yourself filtered through a medium, much like trying to catch a whisper coming from another room. The Greeks understood the inherent danger of this blurred self-image, which is why they gave us the haunting myth of Narcissus. We remember him as the beautiful youth who fell in love with his own reflection in a pool, but he actually fell in love with an illusion that wasn't real. Because he couldn't recognize the distortion of the water, he reached for the image and eventually drowned in his own obsession. This story serves as a warning about the peril of misunderstanding our own reflection, especially when our self-image is tied to such an unstable, natural phenomenon. In those days, your identity remained fluid and communal, defined by your tribe and your place in the cosmos, rather than the individual face staring back from the water. This limited view meant the sharp, isolated I we recognize today had not yet been born, leaving you as a member of a community or a player in a grand religious myth. The human desire for clarity is a relentless force, and we are all alchemists at heart, forever trying to transform the obscure into the known. Taking the next great leap, the Romans, those ancient masters of engineering, began experimenting with the possibilities of glass. They crafted small, thick discs and backed them with lead or bronze, creating the first faint glimmers of what we would eventually recognize as a mirror. However, the technology remained crude, and the glass was often filled with bubbles, tinted green, and frustratingly opaque. Instead of a clear view, the reflection was murky and frequently darker than the polished bronze it was meant to replace. It offered a promise of clarity that it simply couldn't keep and then the Dark Ages fell across Europe. As the centuries passed, the sophisticated knowledge of glassmaking faded away, and the recipe for a clear reflection was lost like a secret buried in the dust of time. For a long period, mirrors retreated from the physical world and into the realm of symbolism. In the medieval era, these objects took on a moral and religious weight, where a mirror was not used to see your face, but rather to examine the state of your soul. It represented a spiritual kind of truth and self-knowledge that had little to do with vanity. Among the aristocracy, mirrors were tiny, precious treasures often set in ivory or gold. Yet looking into one was an exercise in pure frustration, because the image was small, distorted, and tarnished so easily, it required constant, vigorous polishing just to remain usable. Your reflection was something you had to actively maintain, much like a garden, because it was never just there, waiting for you with instant clarity. This technical struggle reinforced a deep social distance, as only the incredibly wealthy could afford these imperfect trinkets, making self-perception a blurred and expensive privilege. This lack of a clear image was a fundamental fact of daily life. Picture a knight preparing for battle and catching his reflection in a breastplate polished to a high sheen, which only gave back a warped and elongated version of himself. He saw a giant in metal, a strange and distorted figure that barely resembled a man. A merchant in a bustling town might catch a glimpse of his face in a pane of thick, greenish window glass, but the image would be ghostly and layered over the world outside. Because of this constant distortion, people usually experience their own faces through the eyes of others, finding themselves in fleeting moments of conversation rather than in a glass. There was no opportunity for the quiet, prolonged self-scrutiny that we take for granted today, and the mirror remained a tool of suggestion rather than a definition of reality. It hinted at a person's appearance without ever delivering the cold truth, leaving a vast gap between the inner self and the outer world that was filled by imagination and faith. The moment of true ignition didn't happen in a grand palace, but rather in the smoky, secretive workshops of Murano, a small island tucked away in the Venetian lagoon. By the 13th century, the Venetian Republic feared that the massive furnaces would burn their wooden city to the ground, so they ordered every glassmaker to move their operations to this isolated island. This was far more than a simple safety measure, as it functioned as a strategic lockdown of the highest order. While these craftsmen were treated like royalty, they were also prisoners of the state who were forbidden from leaving the Republic under the penalty of death. Their knowledge was a national treasure, and Venice was determined to protect its monopoly on the world's most valuable trade secrets. The air on Murano stayed thick with ash and mystery, as masters guarded their recipes with the same intensity as a military commander. These men were the true alchemists of sand and fire, and their ultimate goal was to create a glass so colorless and pure that it looked like frozen air. After generations of trial and error, they finally achieved the impossible by creating Cristallo, which was the clearest glass the world had ever seen. Even though it was a triumph of chemistry, it was only half of the puzzle because they still lacked a perfect reflective backing to go with it. The old methods of using lead or bronze still resulted in a dull, tinted image, and the birth of the true mirror required one more daring alchemical leap. That breakthrough arrived in the 16th century, and it was a process that was as dangerous to the lungs as it was brilliant to the eye. The mercury silvering method. Venetian glassmakers found that by applying a thin mixture of tin and mercury to the back of a sheet of Cristallo, they could produce a reflection that was staggeringly bright and accurate. It was a total revelation for the human experience. For the first time in history, a person could look into a flat surface and see themselves not as a shadowy ghost, but with a sharp and undeniable clarity. Every pore, every stray hair, and every subtle shift of emotion was captured perfectly, transforming the mirror from a decorative toy into a precise instrument of truth. The mirrors coming out of Murano quickly became the most coveted objects in all of Europe. They were fabulously expensive symbols of power, and a single Venetian mirror could cost as much as a massive warship or a sprawling country estate. These were not just functional household items, but works of art framed in precious metals and adorned with sparkling gems. To own one was to possess a piece of modern magic, and naturally every other European power was desperate to steal the secret for themselves. The French government eventually resorted to industrial espionage, bribing and smuggling Venetian masters to Paris in a high-stakes game where those caught faced certain assassination. Even though the knowledge slowly leaked into France and Germany, the Venetian mirror remained the gold standard for nearly 200 years. It was a secret born from isolation and fire, and it forever changed how the world saw itself, both on the surface and deep within the mind. Close your eyes and imagine the scene. It is the late 1500s, and you are a noblewoman navigating the intricate politics of a European court. For your entire life, your reflection has been a ghost, a dim and golden suggestion caught in the surface of polished metal. One afternoon, a heavy crate arrives in your chamber containing a new acquisition, a Venetian glass mirror framed in dark, cold ebony. As you approach the glass and lean in, the world shifts because for the very first time, you truly meet yourself. This was not a blurry approximation of a face, but your actual face, and the shock of that clarity must have been staggering. It was the difference between reading a poem about a voice and hearing a high-fidelity recording of your own words for the first time. There you stood in perfect, silent detail, experiencing what we might call the first true gaze. The social and psychological consequences of this clarity were both immediate and radical. Before this moment, your identity was a mosaic shaped by the words of others, built on what your family, your servants, and your rivals told you about your own appearance. Suddenly, you possessed a direct and private line to your own image, which birthed a new form of self-awareness that felt both empowering and like a beautiful prison. Vanity, at least in the way we recognize it today, arrived in that heartbeat. People began to scrutinize their own features with a new intensity, noticing the slight asymmetries of a nose or the fine lines carved by years of laughter and grief. This mirror created a fresh relationship with the self that relied on constant visual feedback, and it is no historical accident that the rise of the personal mirror happened alongside the explosion of self-portraiture. Artists like Rembrandt and Dürer treated these glass surfaces as silent confessors, staring into them for hours to map the topography of their own skin. They weren't just looking for a likeness. They were hunting for the soul, using the mirror to turn the artist into his own most complicated subject. For the aristocracy, these mirrors quickly transformed into the ultimate symbol of status and grace. They moved out of the private shadows of the bedroom and into the grand halls where they could be seen by everyone. To fill a massive room with mirrors was to put your unimaginable wealth and power on display for the world to envy. It was a clever way of capturing light and multiplying physical space, creating an illusion of grandeur that seemed to go on forever. However, this technology also multiplied the individual, meaning you were no longer just one person standing in a room. You became a person reflected from a dozen angles at once, reinforcing the idea that the individual was a central, observable entity. Your appearance became a lifelong project that required constant management, improvement, and careful presentation to the public. This created a feedback loop between the inner spirit and the outer image that has only grown more intense over the following centuries. We had stepped out of the communal shadow of the Middle Ages and into the sharp, sometimes unforgiving, light of self-examination. The age of the individual had finally begun, and it was reflected perfectly in a thin sheet of Venetian glass. This growing obsession with the reflected self eventually found its ultimate temple, not in a quiet home, but in a palace designed entirely for spectacle. Versailles. Within the famed Galerie de Glace, the mirror was weaponized to serve the interests of absolute power. It was no longer merely a tool for personal grooming, but a massive architectural statement that redefined how people move through space. The Hall of Mirrors remains a breathtaking piece of deception, consisting of a long, narrow gallery where one wall is lined with giant windows and the opposite wall features 17 massive arches filled with Venetian glass. This design was a psychological masterstroke because it captures the sunlight and doubles it, bathing every visitor in a radiant and crystalline glow. More importantly, the architecture multiplies the people inside. So as you walk through the hall, you see yourself reflected again and again until you recede into a visual infinity. You are no longer a single person walking through a room. You have become a crowd of selves. This was the core message of the monarchy, suggesting that the king's power and the court that reflected it were both infinite and divine. The private act of looking at oneself had been transformed into a grand public performance. The mirror had changed the world, not by becoming cheap or common, but by making the spectacle of the self a shared experience where you were both the viewer and the view. True democratization finally arrived with the heavy gears of industrialization. During the 19th century, a German chemist named Justus von Liebig developed a revolutionary method for applying a thin, flawless layer of silver directly onto glass. This single breakthrough meant that clear mirrors could be mass-produced for the first time in history, transforming them into affordable, everyday objects found in almost every home. The solitary luxury of self-scrutiny, once a right reserved strictly for royalty, suddenly belonged to everyone. This shift accelerated when photography appeared on the scene, freezing the mirrored gaze into a permanent, physical record. For the first time, you could hold an objective image of your own face in your hands, and the feedback loop of self-perception began to tighten. As we moved into the 20th century, the invention of the cosmetic mirror introduced an unforgiving, shadowless light into our daily rituals. This era also gave us the portable compact, which acted as a private universe of self-correction tucked away in a purse or pocket. We gradually entered an age defined by constant self-monitoring, and today that evolution has reached a dizzying peak through the glow of social media. Our smartphones have become digital mirrors we consult hundreds of times a day, but we no longer project our image for a small hall of aristocrats. Instead, we curate and filter our lives for a vast global gallery. We live within a perpetual hall of mirrors, where each of us struggles to control our own reflection inside an infinite digital court. It makes me wonder if we have finally gained true clarity, or if we simply traded the ancient blur of water for new, algorithmically shaped distortions. We see ourselves more than any generation in human history, yet that gaze is almost always filtered through the heavy lens of performance. This has been our long, winding journey through the glass. We have traveled from the dark, wavering guesses found in a still pool of water to the sharp, cold truth of modern silvered glass. The mirror did far more than show us our tired eyes or morning smiles. It actually forged the very idea of the modern individual. It carved out a space between the inner I and the outer me, turning the act of self-awareness into a lifelong visual dialogue. While it certainly gave us vanity, it also provided the tools for self-knowledge, the inspiration for art, and a deeply personal relationship with our own existence. Through the mirror, we learned how to see, and in that seeing, we were forced to ask, who is that person looking back? The next time you catch your reflection in a passing window or a bathroom mirror, I want you to pause for just a second. Look past the surface and see the end of a long, incredible metamorphosis. You are looking at the culmination of 1,000 years of fire, industrial secrecy, and human longing. It is the story of the day we finally saw ourselves, and in doing so forever changed what it meant to be seen.